Preface to the first edition. Hannah Arendt opens by locating the book in the aftermath of two world wars, revolutions, mass displacement, and the collapse of inherited political certainties. The central experience of the age is not simply war, but homelessness and rootlessness on a scale earlier European political thought had not been built to understand. People have been torn from the social and political worlds that once gave them a place, while governments and movements have acquired powers that seem to violate ordinary assumptions about interest, moderation, and common sense. Arendt rejects both easy optimism and easy despair. The belief that history necessarily progresses and the belief that catastrophe is inevitable are, for her, parallel superstitions. The task is comprehension. By comprehension, she does not mean excusing crimes, reducing unprecedented events to familiar precedents, or smoothing horror into a reassuring historical pattern. She means facing reality without denial and without surrendering to it. The 20th century has imposed a burden of events that political thought has to bear consciously. The book therefore investigates what she calls the hidden mechanics, by which traditional elements of European political and social life were loosened from their old settings and recombined in unprecedented ways. Antisemitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism are not simply older hatreds, conquest, and dictatorship under new names. Each acquired a specifically modern structure. Antisemitism became a political ideology and a catalytic principle of the Nazi movement. Imperialism transformed economic expansion into a principle of endless political expansion and power. Totalitarianism attempted something still more radical: the organization of human beings for total domination, and the construction of a fictitious world in which reality itself could be subordinated to ideological consistency. Arendt stresses the grotesque disproportion between some historical causes and their later consequences. A political problem as apparently limited as the Jewish question could become central to a movement that produced world war and extermination. Economic pressures connected with overseas expansion could help dissolve the political framework of the nation-state. Movements that advertise themselves as brutally realistic could become distinguished by contempt for facts. Modern humanity could possess unprecedented technical power, while individuals experienced unprecedented political impotence. For Arendt, totalitarian domination is not simply a particularly cruel government. Its attempt at global conquest and the total organization of human beings points toward destruction of the human capacity for spontaneity itself. In the camps, she will argue later, the totalitarian belief that everything is possible becomes experimental practice. There appears a kind of evil that cannot be adequately explained through ordinary motives, such as greed, revenge, or ambition. Yet she also refuses nostalgia. The destructive elements of modern history were intertwined with genuine developments. Imperial expansion helped create a single world. The bourgeois pursuit of power exposed previously unseen capacities of political organization. Totalitarian movements revealed, with terrible clarity, weaknesses and uncertainties that had long existed beneath European civilization. The answer cannot be simply to recover an untouched past, because no such intact past remains available. The deeper political conclusion is that human dignity needs a new guarantee. Traditional rights and inherited institutions proved unable to protect people who fell outside recognized political communities. A new political principle would have to recognize humanity as a whole, while still limiting power through concrete political institutions. The book is an effort to understand how the old guarantees failed and how the subterranean elements of Western history came to the surface. Arendt's insistence on comprehension also explains the structure of the book. She does not tell a continuous story in which one cause inevitably produces the next. Antisemitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism have different histories. Their elements become politically decisive only when older institutions have weakened enough for them to combine. The method is therefore genealogical without being deterministic. She follows ideas, social positions, administrative techniques, and political crises until their later significance becomes visible. This also guards against the temptation to make totalitarianism seem foreign to European civilization. The elements she studies did not arrive from outside an otherwise healthy tradition. They developed within the modern European world itself. The horror is precisely that institutions, ideas, and social processes familiar in less extreme forms could be detached from their limits and recombined into something unprecedented. Preface to Part 1. Antisemitism. Arendt begins the first part by drawing a sharp distinction between modern antisemitism and the much older history of religious hostility toward Jews. 19th century anti-Semitism was a secular political ideology. It borrowed emotions and images from older prejudice, but it cannot be understood as the uninterrupted continuation of medieval Jew hatred. To treat persecution from antiquity to Hitler as one continuous story is historically misleading and, more importantly, prevents us from seeing what was specifically modern about anti-Semitism. The position of European Jewry changed profoundly with the rise of the nation-state and emancipation. Jews had spent centuries as a dispersed people with their own religious institutions and a complicated relation to surrounding societies. By the modern period, particularly in Western and Central Europe, emancipation promised civil equality and assimilation. But this occurred at the same time that national belonging became increasingly central to citizenship. Jews were admitted as individuals into states whose political legitimacy was becoming tied to national identity. Arendt also rejects explanations that reduce anti-Semitism to simple religious hatred, economic jealousy, or the behavior of Jews themselves. Political anti-Semitism became important only when hostility to Jews could connect with broader political conflicts. The Jews acquired a peculiar historical position because certain Jewish families and financiers had served monarchies and governments as bankers, suppliers, and international intermediaries. Their usefulness to the state could coexist with the political weakness of Jews as a group. Indeed, their apparent influence and actual lack of sovereign power formed one of the paradoxes on which anti-Semitic fantasies later fed. The history Arendt wants to reconstruct is therefore relational. She is interested in the changing place of Jews within the European state system and bourgeois society, in the decline of the old state-Jewish relationship, and in the way political and social resentment crystallized around Jews during the decay of the nation-state. The Nazi use of anti-Semitism cannot be explained by assuming that Jews had always been hated in the same way. It has to be connected to the transformation of European politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Preface to Part 2. Imperialism. Arendt dates the imperialist age roughly from the scramble for Africa in the 1880s to the outbreak of the First World War. The period appears peaceful inside Europe, yet abroad it witnessed rapid conquest, racial domination, bureaucratic experimentation, and economic expansion. In retrospect, this era contains political elements that later became important to totalitarian movements. Imperialism, in Arendt's usage, is not simply empire or conquest. Empires had existed throughout history. What was new was the principle of expansion for expansion's sake. Capitalist development had produced surplus capital that could no longer find sufficiently profitable investment within national borders. Business interests increasingly required political protection overseas. A bourgeoisie that had previously been content to dominate society economically began demanding political power from the state in order to support endless expansion. This produced a conflict with the nation-state. A nation-state is bounded. Its laws claim validity for citizens within a defined political community. Endless expansion, by contrast, has no natural political limit. European powers therefore ruled conquered peoples without extending genuine citizenship to them. Government by law at home was increasingly combined with arbitrary rule, bureaucracy, racial hierarchy, and decree abroad. The colonial world became a laboratory in which power could be exercised without the restraints that still existed inside the nation. Race thinking and bureaucracy were especially important innovations. Race could justify permanent inequality between rulers and ruled, when conquest could no longer plausibly be presented as temporary administration. Bureaucracy could replace government by law with anonymous administration, decree, and process. The imperialist official did not have to build a shared political world with the people he governed. He could treat populations as material to be administered. Continental imperialism developed a different, but related form. Pan-German and Pan-Slav movements could not expand into distant overseas spaces in the same way as Britain or France. Instead, they imagined continental peoples united by racial, ethnic, or historical destiny across existing state borders. They attacked the nation-state and the party system while claiming direct identification with a people or race. In this form, the concept of a movement standing above parties, and even above the state, began to appear. The First World War exposed the weakness of the European nation-state system. The collapse of multinational empires created minorities, refugees, and stateless people whose rights could not be guaranteed by the states in which they lived. Imperialism thus leads directly into Arendt's analysis of the decline of the rights of man. The modern state had proclaimed universal rights, but in practice, those rights proved dependent on national citizenship. Preface to Part 3. Totalitarianism. In the later preface to the section on totalitarianism, Arendt reflects on the historical evidence that became available after the first edition, and on the fate of totalitarian rule after Hitler and Stalin. She continues to treat Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union as the two authentic examples of totalitarian domination, while emphasizing that totalitarianism must be distinguished from ordinary dictatorship, tyranny, authoritarianism, and one-party rule. The distinction is particularly important in the Soviet case. Stalin's death did not produce constitutional freedom. The Soviet Union remained a one-party dictatorship, censorship continued, political trials remained possible, and the state retained enormous arbitrary power. Yet, Arendt argues that total domination itself receded. Under Stalin, terror was not merely used against opponents. It was a permanent institution capable of selecting new categories of enemies, even after old opposition had been destroyed. After Stalin, people could again possess limited spaces of private and intellectual life. Manuscript literature could circulate. Dissidents could speak in court and receive support outside it. These differences are politically decisive because totalitarianism aims not merely to punish opposition, but to eliminate spontaneous, independent human activity. Arendt points to Stalin's final years as evidence that the terror was not winding down naturally. The post-war purges, the Leningrad affair, and especially the doctors' plot suggested preparation for another large-scale purge. The accusation of a Jewish conspiracy also moved Soviet ideology toward a pattern disturbingly similar to Nazi fantasies of world Jewry. Stalin's death interrupted this process. The later Soviet regime could relapse into totalitarianism because the constitutional barriers against arbitrary power were weak. But Arendt still insists that dictatorship and total domination are not identical. This clarification matters for the structure of the book. Arendt is not offering a general theory of every oppressive government. She is trying to isolate the elements of a historically new form of rule. Totalitarian regimes destroy classes and reorganize populations into masses. They replace parties with movements. They create fictitious ideological worlds whose claims are treated as more authoritative than observable facts. They use terror after opposition has already been crushed, because terror is not merely an instrument for securing obedience. It is part of an attempt to make reality conform to an alleged law of history or nature. The concentration and extermination camps become central because they represent the extreme form of this project. They are not simply prisons for enemies. They are laboratories in which human beings are stripped of legal status, moral individuality, spontaneity, and finally life itself. The larger argument of Part 3 will ask how mass society, propaganda, organization, police power, ideology, and terror could produce such a form of domination. At the same time, Arendt resists the idea that totalitarianism is permanent or invincible. Hitler's regime ended in military defeat. Stalin's form of total domination ended with Stalin. What remains is the historical possibility revealed by them. Modern political conditions have shown that a government can attempt to transform human plurality into a single organized process. Understanding that possibility is necessary precisely because its institutional form can disappear, while some of the conditions that made it conceivable remain. The post-Stalin evidence also sharpens Arendt's criterion for identifying totalitarian rule. Political repression alone is insufficient. The decisive question is whether the regime still attempts to eliminate every independent source of spontaneity and reorganize society through permanent terror. A dictatorship may imprison dissidents and censor literature while still leaving spaces of private life, professional activity, memory, and unofficial association that total domination seeks to destroy. For this reason, detotalitariization can occur without democratization. The Soviet Union after Stalin remained profoundly unfree, but the distinction between almost no independent intellectual life and a clandestine literature matters. Likewise, the possibility that defendants can deny charges in court and that their words can circulate outside the courtroom marks a break from the totalitarian attempt to make victims disappear without a public trace. Part 1. Antisemitism. Chapter 1. Antisemitism as an outrage to common sense. Arendt begins with what seems to be an obvious puzzle. The Nazi movement placed anti-Semitism at the center of its ideology, Yet Jews were a small minority without a state, army, or independent political power capable of threatening Europe. The scale of hatred and destruction seems grotesquely disproportionate to the actual position of Jews. Explanations that simply call anti-Semitism irrational do not solve the problem. The task is to understand how this particular ideology acquired such political force. She rejects two common ideas. The first is the scapegoat theory, according to which Jews were an accidental group chosen to carry frustrations that could just as easily have been directed elsewhere. If the victims were entirely interchangeable, the long political preparation of antisemitism would remain unexplained. The second is the doctrine of eternal antisemitism, the belief that Jews have always been hated, and therefore modern persecution needs no special explanation. That view turns history into fate, and makes both Jewish and non-Jewish actors strangely irrelevant. Modern antisemitism, Arendt argues, must be studied through the concrete relationship between Jews and the European nation-state. Jewish communities had historically performed functions for monarchies and governments, especially in finance, because their international connections and political separateness made them useful intermediaries. As the modern state developed, selected Jewish families could become closely associated with state finance, even while Jews as a people remained socially distinct and politically vulnerable. This produced a dangerous image. Jews could appear connected with governments and financial power while lacking genuine political power of their own. Groups hostile to the state could therefore express their hostility through attacks on Jews, who were imagined as the hidden beneficiaries or manipulators of authority. Political antisemitism grew when the old state structure itself began to weaken, and when groups seeking to attack that structure found the Jewish question a useful point of concentration. Arendt's analysis is therefore neither a history of all Jewish suffering nor a claim that antisemitism mechanically caused totalitarianism. It identifies one of the elements that later entered the totalitarian combination. The next chapters follow the special role of Jews in the nation-state, their ambiguous social emancipation, and the Dreyfus Affair, as a moment when anti-Semitic politics nearly broke the French Republic. Arendt also warns against explaining anti-Semitism by attributing collective responsibility to Jews for the hatred directed against them. A group's historical actions can and should be studied, but persecution cannot be justified retroactively by searching the victim's behavior for a cause proportionate to the crime. The political historian must distinguish between conditions that made an ideology plausible and responsibility for what its adherents chose to do. The apparent common-sense explanation that Jews were hated because they were powerful is especially misleading. Their political usefulness to states was often greatest when they were socially isolated and lacked an independent political base. Their vulnerability increased as the state system that had protected and used them weakened. Anti-Semitism could therefore rise at the moment when actual Jewish influence declined, because the image of influence survived as a political myth. This reversal becomes a recurring feature of Arendt's analysis. Groups can become more visible symbolically as they become weaker institutionally. Political movements then attack the symbol as though destroying it would solve the wider crisis from which the resentment emerged. Chapter 2. The Jews, the Nation-State, and the Birth of Antisemitism. Arendt places the political history of modern European Jewry inside the development of the nation-state. The nation-state promised equality before the law, yet the society it governed remained divided into unequal classes. Jews entered this structure in a peculiar way. Their emancipation was often promoted from above by states that still found certain Jews useful as financiers and intermediaries. They could therefore receive legal equality, while remaining socially exceptional and politically identified with governments rather than with any major class. Under absolutist monarchies, court Jews and state bankers had provided rulers with credit, supplies, and international financial connections. These services were particularly important because European monarchies frequently needed funds for wars, and because older estates and classes could resist direct taxation. Jewish financiers could operate across borders and family networks. In return, they received privileges, protection, and sometimes extraordinary personal status. Equality first appeared not as a universal political right, but as a privilege granted to useful individuals. The rise of the modern nation-state gradually transformed this relationship. Emancipation extended legal equality to Jews as individuals. But Arendt stresses an ambiguity. States were becoming national at the same time that citizenship was being universalized. Jews were admitted to political equality in communities that increasingly understood themselves through national belonging. Their historical separateness, once useful to monarchies, now made their relationship to the nation more difficult. The Rothschild family symbolized the peak of the older arrangement. Their banking network could serve different governments and operate internationally in a period when national economies were still closely tied to state finance. Their success also created an exaggerated public image of Jewish financial power, yet this international role depended on a specific political system. Once imperialism changed the scale of capital, and business required direct political expansion overseas, governments no longer relied on Jewish financiers in the same way. Large national bourgeoisies and banks could provide capital and demand state support themselves. Arendt's point is that the decline of Jewish usefulness to the state came at roughly the same time that political anti-Semitism intensified. This contradicts the simple belief that Jews were attacked because their real power was increasing without limit. The old Jewish-state relationship was weakening. But public images created during that relationship survived and became politically available to movements hostile to governments and parliamentary institutions. Early political anti-Semitism first became significant when it attached itself to broader conflicts. In Prussia after the Napoleonic defeat, reform from above weakened aristocratic privilege and opened opportunities to the bourgeoisie. Parts of the nobility could attack Jewish emancipation as a symbol of a state they resented. When aristocrats later regained influence, their anti-Semitism often declined into ordinary social discrimination. The pattern suggests that hostility became politically explosive when Jews could be identified with a state or social transformation already opposed for other reasons. By the late 19th century, new anti-Semitic parties appeared in Germany, Austria, and France. Financial scandals, speculative crises, and the frustrations of the lower middle classes contributed to their appeal. These parties differed from older prejudice because they treated anti-Semitism as a political program and sought power through organization. They often presented themselves as standing above ordinary class conflict and attacked both the state and existing parties. One of their striking features was their tendency toward supranational cooperation. Although their rhetoric was nationalist, anti-Semitic groups attempted to link themselves across borders because they claimed to be confronting an international Jewish power. This contradiction foreshadowed later movements that used nationalism as propaganda while organizing themselves according to principles that could transcend the nation-state. Arendt emphasizes the alliance between aristocratic resentment and lower middle class or mob hostility. Elements of the old aristocracy could see Jews as beneficiaries of modernization and attack them in a last struggle against the bourgeois order. Petty bourgeois groups affected by economic insecurity could adopt similar language for very different reasons. Anti-Semitism supplied a common enemy around which otherwise incompatible grievances could be organized. She also examines the complicated position of the political left. Socialist movements generally opposed anti-Semitism, but certain strands of left-wing criticism of finance could slide into attacks on Jewish bankers. This was especially dangerous where Jews were stereotyped as embodiments of capitalism, rather than understood as a diverse population occupying many different social positions. Yet Arendt does not interpret modern anti-Semitism as a simple product of socialism or capitalism. Its political strength depended on the crisis of the nation-state and the availability of Jews as symbols in conflicts whose real sources lay elsewhere. France became the most important case because anti-Semitism there entered national politics with exceptional force during the Dreyfus Affair. Unlike Germany, where 19th-century anti-Semitic parties declined during periods of prosperity, France allowed the issue to divide state institutions, army, church, press, and public opinion. The affair would reveal how a seemingly narrow accusation against one Jewish officer could become a battle over the meaning of the Republic itself. The years before the First World War nevertheless seemed to many Europeans like a golden age of security. Economic growth was strong, states appeared stable, and anti-Semitic movements could temporarily decline. Political weakness was hidden beneath prosperity. Economic forces seemed more important than political structures, and many people assumed that European civilization had achieved a durable equilibrium. For Jews, this period was especially deceptive. Many had become culturally assimilated, professionally successful, and socially visible. The older political relationship with governments was fading, and organized antisemitism could appear marginal. Yet social acceptance remained conditional. Jews were frequently welcomed as exceptional individuals precisely because they were regarded as different from ordinary members of their own group. Fame, talent, wealth, or cultural distinction could open doors that ordinary equality did not. The danger was that political and social roles did not coincide. Jews could lose the special political functions that had connected them with governments while continuing to carry the social image of unusual influence. At the same time, a class society in decay increasingly sought symbolic explanations for insecurity. The Jewish question could therefore become a catalyst through which broader resentments were organized. Arendt ends the chapter by turning from the political history of emancipation toward the social history of Jews who entered bourgeois society as pariahs, parvenus, celebrities, and outsiders. Arendt further divides the history into distinct phases, because the Jewish relationship to state power was never constant. In the age of absolute monarchy, individual court Jews could be indispensable, because rulers needed credit beyond what traditional estates supplied. As states centralized and public credit developed, these functions became organized through a small number of prominent banking families. Emancipation then generalized legal rights at precisely the moment when the special economic services that had justified privileges were beginning to lose their old importance. This timing produced political misperception. Jews were increasingly visible as citizens and professionals, just as their exceptional relationship to governments was declining. Anti-Semites could therefore attack them as though emancipation had created a new ruling power, when in Arendt's account, emancipation often marked the end of the older function from which the image of power had arisen. The political myth survived the social reality that had produced it. She also stresses that anti-Semitic parties failed at first to become permanent mass movements. In Germany, their electoral strength declined when prosperity returned. Their importance lies less in uninterrupted success than in the new political vocabulary they created. They organized hostility to Jews as a program, claimed to transcend ordinary party interests, and imagined international cooperation against an international enemy. These innovations could remain available even when the original parties disappeared. Chapter 3. The Jews and Society. Arendt now shifts from the relation between Jews and the state to their place in European society. Political emancipation promised equality before the law, but social acceptance operated according to very different rules. Jews often discovered that society was fascinated by them as exceptional individuals, while remaining suspicious of Jews as a group. The result was a peculiar pressure to become both assimilated and conspicuously different. She describes a recurring choice between the pariah and the parvenu. The pariah remains visibly outside respectable society and can therefore preserve a degree of independence from its judgments. The parvenu seeks admission and advancement, often by proving that he is not like the stereotyped image of ordinary Jews. Assimilation could thus require an individual to distance himself from his own people, while society continued to define him by Jewishness. This contradiction produced what Arendt sees as a socially constructed Jewish type. Once religion and nationality became less decisive for assimilated Jews, society increasingly interpreted Jewishness as a set of psychological qualities: sensitivity, cleverness, ambition, exoticism, nervousness, or mysterious difference. Jews who had been told to abandon collective distinctiveness were then rediscovered socially as interesting, because they were different. Assimilation did not eliminate discrimination. It changed its language. Enlightened supporters of emancipation often contributed unintentionally to this pattern. They welcomed Jews who appeared educated, cultivated, and exceptional, while contrasting them with the supposedly backward mass of Jewry. The emancipated Jew was therefore invited to enter society on condition that he accept a distinction between himself and other Jews. Arendt sees this demand as demoralizing, because equality was offered not as a right, but as recognition of personal exception. The figure of the parvenu flourished in salons and elite circles, where social distinction itself was a central value. The same society that excluded Jews generally could prize a famous Jewish writer, musician, financier, or intellectual, precisely because the outsider's difference added novelty. Social antisemitism and social attraction were therefore not opposites. They could reinforce one another. The Jew was desirable as an exception because the group remained marked as different. Arendt uses Benjamin Disraeli as the most elaborate example of a person who turned this ambiguity into a personal myth. Disraeli was born Jewish, baptized as a child, and rose to the highest levels of British political life. Rather than minimizing his origin, he transformed Jewishness into a romantic doctrine of aristocratic superiority, secret influence, ancient race, and historical destiny. His fantasies about Jewish power were not anti-Semitic in intention. They were a form of pride and self-invention. Yet they supplied themes that anti-Semitic ideologues could later appropriate. Disraeli's success depended on the peculiar openness of British aristocratic society to a brilliant outsider who could present himself as extraordinary. He interpreted Jewish history through the categories of race and aristocracy current in his surroundings. Jews became, in his imagination, an ancient elite whose invisible influence helped shape European affairs. Arendt treats this as an example of how social myths created within Jewish assimilation could converge with fantasies circulating outside it. The broader problem was that European high society increasingly confused difference with vice and fascination with scandal. In fantasical society, groups previously excluded from respectability could become fashionable precisely because they represented forbidden or exotic identities. Arendt places Jews alongside other socially stigmatized figures whose difference became a source of attraction once bourgeois moral conventions began to decay. This dynamic is especially important in her discussion of Marcel Proust's world. Aristocratic and bourgeois society could treat Jewishness as an innate, almost biological secret, something simultaneously shameful and fascinating. A person's origin became a social essence. The more assimilation dissolved visible communal boundaries, the more society seemed to search for hidden signs of difference. Arendt draws a distinction between vice and crime. A crime concerns an act for which a person can be held responsible. A vice is imagined as an innate condition that defines what someone is. When society treats Jewishness in this fashion, political discrimination can become detached from conduct. The person is condemned or admired for an identity understood as unchangeable. The danger becomes clear when social prejudice meets political crisis. Social antisemitism can remain a game of exclusion, fashion, gossip, and fascination as long as institutions are stable. But the language it creates can be transferred into politics. If a group has already been imagined as secretly different by nature, political movements can transform social stereotypes into claims about conspiracy and collective guilt. Arendt, therefore, does not describe assimilation as a simple march from exclusion to equality. Emancipated Jews entered a society whose class structure and moral conventions were themselves undergoing transformation. Their exceptional position exposed contradictions between legal equality and social inequality. The pariah and parvenu became two responses to a world in which Jews were accepted as individuals only by remaining symbolically distinct. The next chapter brings these tensions into open political conflict. In the Dreyfus Affair, the social stereotypes, institutional corruption, military hostility, clerical politics, and mass agitation that had developed separately converged around one falsely accused Jewish officer. France would show how close a European republic could come to allowing antisemitism to redefine the nation itself. Arendt gives special importance to figures who refused the parvenu strategy. Heinrich Heine and other conscious pariahs could transform exclusion into a standpoint from which society itself became visible. The pariah does not gain the protections enjoyed by the fully accepted citizen, but he can preserve intellectual independence, because he does not have to treat the standards of respectable society as final. This possibility explains why some of the most creative Jewish figures in European culture came from people who neither accepted traditional communal isolation nor paid the full social price of assimilation. The parvenu, by contrast, is trapped by success. Admission depends on continuous proof of exceptionality. Because society admires the individual while retaining its prejudice against the group, every achievement can reinforce the demand to distinguish oneself from ordinary Jews. The more complete the social ascent, the more precarious it may become, since a change in fashion or political atmosphere can reactivate the identity society never allowed the individual to forget. Arendt's social history, therefore, helps explain why antisemitism could coexist with intense fascination for Jews. Hatred did not require social distance. In some elite environments, intimacy, admiration, prejudice, and exclusion belong to the same pattern. This ambiguity later made it possible for political antisemitism to draw on social images that had been cultivated even by people who considered themselves tolerant. Chapter 4. The Dreyfus Affair. Arendt treats the Dreyfus Affair as the decisive political episode of 19th-century French antisemitism and as a rehearsal for later conflicts between Republican citizenship and movements that claimed to speak directly for the nation. The case began in 1894 when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer on the French General Staff, was accused of passing military secrets to Germany. He was convicted in a secretive proceeding, publicly degraded, and sent to Devil's Island. The evidence was weak, and the army relied on documents that were hidden from the defense. The affair might have remained an ordinary miscarriage of military justice had later evidence not pointed to another officer, Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. Colonel Georges Picard, who became head of military intelligence, discovered indications that Esterhazy, rather than Dreyfus, had been the spy. Instead of correcting the conviction, senior officers tried to suppress the discovery. The case thereby ceased to concern only one defendant. The honor of the army and the authority of institutions became attached to preservation of a false verdict. For Arendt, this transformation is essential. The French Third Republic was already weakened by corruption, scandals, factionalism, and the unstable relation among parliament, army, church, and public opinion. The Panama scandal had exposed extensive bribery of politicians and journalists, and had involved Jewish financiers as intermediaries. Anti-Semites used these scandals to present Jews as the visible agents of a corrupt parliamentary order, even though corruption extended far beyond Jewish participants. French Jewry itself had become closely tied to the Republic. Emancipation had been associated with revolutionary citizenship, and many Jews regarded Republican institutions as the guarantor of their legal equality. Yet wealthy or socially established Jews often reacted cautiously when Dreyfus was accused. They feared that aggressive defense of one Jewish officer would confirm the charge that Jews constituted a separate political bloc. Their desire to appear fully French could therefore produce passivity, precisely when the rights on which their position depended were under attack. The army represented a different political world. It contained strong aristocratic, monarchist, and clerical influences, and had never been fully integrated into Republican political life. The Catholic Church, and especially elements associated with the Jesuits, became intertwined with anti-Dreyfus agitation. To defend the army against civilian investigation could be presented as defense of nation, tradition, religion, and authority against a supposedly rootless Republican and Jewish conspiracy. The affair created a strange coalition. Monarchists, clerics, nationalist intellectuals, journalists, sections of the army, and the mob could rally around the proposition that the honor of the nation mattered more than the legal innocence of an individual. The Dreyfusards, by contrast, eventually defended not merely Dreyfus, but the Republican principle that the state is bound by law, and that citizenship cannot be suspended for reasons of race, religion, or institutional prestige. Arendt places Georges Clemenceau at the center of this Republican response. What distinguished Clemenceau was his insistence that the case involved the rights of every citizen. If one individual could be sacrificed to a military fiction, then the Republic's legal foundation was at stake. The defense of Dreyfus, therefore, became an assertion of the Jacobin idea of a nation constituted by equal citizens rather than by blood, church, army, or inherited social rank. The anti-Dreyfus movement also exposed Arendt's distinction between the people and the mob. The mob is not simply the poor. It consists of residues and failures from different classes who have been thrown outside stable representation and who can be mobilized through resentment against institutions and groups. In the affair, street agitation and anti-Semitic journalism could create the appearance that the mob represented the authentic voice of the people. Arendt warns against the romantic belief that whatever erupts spontaneously from a crowd is therefore democratic or politically legitimate. The Dreyfusards faced a difficult problem because institutional elites were compromised, and much of respectable society preferred quiet to confrontation. Intellectuals entered politics as a recognizable group, signing petitions and using public argument to challenge the official story. Writers, scholars, lawyers, and journalists helped create a counterpublic capable of forcing the case back into political life. This intervention showed the possibility of solidarity around abstract legal principles, even when no immediate class interest required it. The struggle continued through retrials, political crises, and eventually a pardon and rehabilitation. Dreyfus's pardon did not fully satisfy the Republican principle, because a pardon can leave guilt formally intact. Only exoneration could reverse the injustice. Yet the political outcome defeated the immediate attempt to turn antisemitism into the organizing principle of the French state. Arendt emphasizes how contingent this success was. France possessed republican traditions, political opponents capable of mobilizing around rights, and institutions that, however corrupt, were not yet completely destroyed. The anti-Dreyfus coalition failed to transform its moment of mass support into permanent rule. France also lacked the kind of fully developed imperialist movement that could have linked domestic antisemitism to a broader ideology of expansion and racial destiny. The affair nevertheless foreshadowed the 20th century. It showed how easily an apparently technical or judicial case could become a struggle over national identity, how institutions could prefer fabricated consistency to factual truth, how antisemitism could unite groups with different interests, how the mob could be mistaken for the people, and how law could be treated as an obstacle to a supposedly higher national purpose. For Arendt, the most important lesson is that rights survive only when citizens are prepared to defend them politically. The Republic was saved not by the automatic operation of law, but by people who insisted that the law apply even to a despised or isolated individual. The political meaning of Dreyfus lies in this confrontation between a nation understood as a community of equal citizens and a nationalism prepared to sacrifice legal equality to collective passion. The affair also demonstrates the instability of alliances built around anti-Semitism. Radical anti-Semites presented themselves as enemies of corruption, yet many depended on the same corrupt press, financial networks, and parliamentary intrigues they denounced. Monarchists and clericals used the agitation against Dreyfus to weaken the Republic, while some Republicans tolerated anti-Semitism because they feared confrontation with the army or church more than injustice to one officer. Arendt pays attention to the role of evidence because the case became a struggle over whether facts could compel institutions to correct themselves. Once the army had publicly committed itself to Dreyfus's guilt, every new fact threatened not simply a verdict, but the prestige of the officer corps. Forgery and suppression became easier to justify because institutional honor had been separated from truth. The affair thus anticipates a theme that becomes central in totalitarianism. Organizations can create a fictitious consistency and then treat reality as the enemy of that consistency. The eventual Republican victory also shows the limits of analogy with later totalitarian movements. France still contained independent newspapers, competing parties, courts, parliamentary conflict, and citizens capable of organizing publicly around a principle. Those institutions were damaged but not destroyed. They provided spaces in which a lie could be contested. Totalitarianism would later seek to eliminate precisely these independent sources of factual and political resistance. Part 2. Imperialism. Chapter 5. The Political Emancipation of the Bourgeoisie. Arendt begins the imperialism section with the period from the scramble for Africa in the 1880s to the First World War. Inside Europe, these decades could appear stable. Outside Europe, they produced breathtaking territorial expansion. The central political change was what she calls the emancipation of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois class had already achieved enormous economic power, but, unlike earlier ruling classes, had generally allowed the state to conduct political affairs. Imperialism changed that relationship. Capitalist development had reached a point at which surplus capital sought investments beyond national borders. Domestic markets appeared saturated, and investors looked toward mines, railways, plantations, loans, and extraction abroad. Exporting capital, however, exposed investments to political risks that private business could not control. Business, therefore, demanded the protection of national governments. The export of capital was followed by the export of political power. This is the background to Cecil Rhodes's famous formula that expansion is everything. Arendt treats the phrase seriously because it expresses something new. Earlier conquest normally aimed at a defined territory, strategic advantage, tribute, or incorporation. Imperialism converted expansion itself into a permanent principle. Economic accumulation, once detached from ordinary limits of consumption and national markets, appeared to require a corresponding accumulation of political power without a final endpoint. The principle was incompatible with the nation-state. A nation-state rests on a bounded political community and, at least in principle, on equality of citizens before law. It can conquer another people, but if it permanently incorporates, that people, while denying equal citizenship, it contradicts its own legal foundation. If it grants equality, the conquered population may transform the character of the nation. Imperialism therefore tended toward rule over subjects who were neither citizens nor temporary enemies. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and other powers developed different colonial systems, but all face this contradiction. Arendt notes that British imperial administrators often avoided extending British political institutions fully to conquered peoples. They preserved local customs where convenient and maintained a distance between rulers and ruled. This could reduce some forms of cultural assimilation, but it also institutionalized the idea that equal law did not apply across the imperial domain. The bourgeois demand for power altered political philosophy as well. Arendt turns to Thomas Hobbes because she sees in him a remarkably pure anticipation of a society organized around private interest and the accumulation of power. In Hobbes's account, individuals are fundamentally separate, competitive, and insecure. The Commonwealth arises because a superior power is needed to restrain them. Social bonds have no independent moral substance. They depend on power capable of enforcing order. Arendt reads this as a political philosophy suited to a bourgeoisie that understands public life through the categories of private competition. If individuals seek endlessly to increase power because only greater power can secure what they already possess, then political expansion becomes analogous to capital accumulation. Power is no longer a means toward a stable political community. It becomes a self-feeding process whose continuation is its own justification. This produces a profound change in the idea of politics. Traditional political communities establish boundaries and laws within which people can act together. Imperialism distrusts boundaries because they interrupt expansion. The nation-state's law becomes an inconvenience when capital and power must move continuously outward. The bourgeoisie, therefore, begins demanding a state strong enough to protect expansion, but flexible enough to escape the legal limitations of the national political order. Arendt then examines the alliance between capital and the mob. Overseas investment initially attracted people whose money could not find profitable domestic employment. Adventurers, speculators, financiers, and social outsiders gathered around colonial enterprise. At the same time, European societies produced groups that did not fit securely into the class structure: failures, displaced people, and those who resented respectable bourgeois society without possessing an alternative political project. The mob and the bourgeoisie could meet around imperial expansion for different reasons. Capital wanted opportunities abroad. The mob wanted careers, adventure, status, and a world in which ordinary social restraints no longer applied. The colonies offered both. People who were marginal at home could become officials, conquerors, police, or entrepreneurs abroad, exercising enormous power over populations that lacked legal protection. Arendt does not equate the mob with the working class. The mob is the refuse of all classes, generated by the breakdown and exclusion of class society. Its political importance lies in its hostility to existing institutions and its willingness to celebrate power without responsibility. Imperialism gave such people a field in which domination could be practiced openly. The colonial world, therefore, became a school for political attitudes later carried back into Europe: contempt for law, admiration for administrative efficiency unconstrained by rights, racial hierarchy, and the idea that power should expand because it can. The point is not that colonial officials simply became totalitarians. It is that imperialism loosened political practices from the national institutions that had previously limited them. Arendt repeatedly stresses the gap between motives and consequences. Businessmen pursuing investment did not set out to destroy the nation-state. Governments seeking raw materials did not necessarily intend to create totalitarian politics. Yet the logic of endless expansion undermined political boundaries, transformed power into an independent goal, and encouraged forms of rule that treated whole populations as administrable material rather than citizens. Imperialism is thus a preparatory history. It politically emancipated a bourgeois class whose private economic principles had not previously provided a coherent public philosophy. It created alliances with social outcasts. It exported arbitrary power to territories beyond the protection of national law. And it generated the concepts of expansion and power accumulation that movements in the 20th century would radicalize far beyond the original colonial context. The export of surplus capital also transformed the relation between economic risk and political responsibility. Investors could pursue profits in territories whose instability would ordinarily make investment unattractive, then demand that national governments secure concessions, protect property, or intervene militarily. Private risk was increasingly backed by public power. The bourgeoisie entered politics not because it suddenly discovered a civic vocation, but because the conditions of accumulation required the state to act abroad on its behalf. Arendt sees this as a reversal of an earlier liberal assumption. Liberal theory had imagined a sphere of private economic activity protected from arbitrary government. Imperialism turned private interest into a demand for unprecedented governmental expansion. The bourgeoisie did not simply ask the state to leave property alone. It asked the state to project force into the world so that accumulation could continue beyond national limits. The alliance with the mob became politically significant because it gave this expansion an emotional constituency. People excluded from respectable careers could identify with conquest as proof of personal and national superiority. Abroad, men of uncertain status at home could become representatives of a superior race. Imperialism, therefore, connected the most powerful economic interests with people who had little stake in the legal and social restraints of established society. The combination weakened the idea that politics should build a durable common world. Expansion, like accumulation, was conceived as process. A process has no natural point of completion. This mentality later reappears in totalitarian movements, which likewise distrust stable institutions because stability would interrupt movement. Chapter 6. Race Thinking Before Racism. Arendt distinguishes race thinking from racism in much the same way that she distinguished older Jew hatred from modern antisemitism. Ideas about inherited character, blood, ancestry, and peoples existed long before imperialism. They became politically decisive only when imperial expansion turned race into an organizing principle of rule. Her purpose is therefore to trace intellectual elements without pretending that ideas mechanically caused later crimes. Race thinking developed in different countries for different political reasons. It could serve aristocratic reaction, national unification, romantic nationalism, or imperial justification. Only later were these strands combined into ideologies, claiming that race revealed the hidden law of history. In France, aristocratic race theories arose partly from conflict between nobility and monarchy. Certain nobles imagined themselves as descendants of conquering Franks ruling over a lower Gallic population. This story could be used to defend aristocratic privilege against the centralized monarchy, and, later, against the democratic nation created by the revolution. Race here was initially a language of class distinction. The nobility presented itself almost as a separate people. The French Revolution weakened this aristocratic use by proclaiming the nation as a community of citizens. Once the people became the source of political legitimacy, theories that treated a hereditary caste as a different race stood in direct opposition to national equality. Yet the vocabulary survived and could later be reworked in new settings. Germany produced another form. Before political unification, German-speaking populations lacked a single state. Romantic thinkers could therefore imagine cultural, linguistic, or spiritual unity, where political unity did not yet exist. National identity acquired an inward, almost organic character. When political institutions were weak, race-like ideas could promise a natural community deeper than law or citizenship. Arendt does not argue that German Romantic nationalism was already Nazi racism. The important point is that when a nation does not exist as a shared political institution, ancestry and cultural origin can become substitutes for citizenship. The people can be imagined as a natural body whose membership precedes political choice. England developed still another tradition. Because England already possessed a strong national state and expanding overseas empire, race thinking could appear in connection with the belief that English institutions reflected superior inherited qualities. The language of the rights of Englishmen differed significantly from universal rights of man. It could celebrate constitutional liberty at home, while assuming that peoples abroad were not equally capable of self-government. Across these cases, Arendt follows the gradual transformation of history into biology. Earlier theories could speak of peoples, nations, aristocracies, and civilizations in political or cultural language. Racial ideology increasingly claimed that visible history was the expression of natural forces transmitted by descent. Social conflict could then be interpreted not as disagreement among citizens, but as struggle among biological groups. The appeal of such thinking increased during imperialism because conquest created a practical demand for permanent distinctions between rulers and ruled. If Europeans governed large populations without intending to make them equal citizens, they needed a principle explaining why inequality was not temporary. Race supplied such a principle. It converted the political fact of domination into an alleged natural hierarchy. This is the point at which race thinking becomes racism in Arendt's stronger sense, not simply prejudice about human groups, but an ideology capable of organizing political action. Racism claims to possess a key to history. Events are interpreted as expressions of racial struggle, and politics becomes the execution of an alleged natural law. Such ideology also changes moral responsibility. If a person is defined by membership in a biological collective, no action can alter the classification. Guilt and innocence become irrelevant. The individual can be punished, not for what he has done, but for what he supposedly is. This logic later becomes central to totalitarian terror, which selects objective enemies according to categories independent of conduct. Arendt's genealogy, therefore, does not seek a single inventor of racism. She shows how different political conflicts generated fragments of race thinking, and how imperialism gave those fragments an institutional field. Theories that had once been speculative, literary, or aristocratic could become practical instruments for governing conquered populations. Arendt also uses the chapter to resist a backward reading of intellectual history, in which every earlier racial speculation is treated as a direct cause of Nazism. Ideas acquire political force only in specific institutional circumstances. A theory that once served noble privilege can later be detached from that setting and joined to mass nationalism. A romantic language of national character can later be biologized. A colonial assumption about supposedly less civilized peoples can later be applied within Europe. The decisive transformation occurs when race ceases to be one possible explanation of human difference and becomes a total explanatory key. Ideology promises to reveal a hidden process behind visible events. Once that happens, historical evidence is reorganized around the theory. Victories, defeats, wealth, poverty, cultural achievement, and political conflict can all be interpreted as expressions of racial struggle. This helps explain why race ideology proved compatible with very different political interests. Aristocrats could use it to defend rank, nationalists to imagine unity, imperialists to justify conquest, and movements to identify permanent enemies. The content changed, but the common structure was the replacement of political relationships, which can be altered by action and law, with natural classifications that individuals cannot escape. Chapter 7. Race and Bureaucracy. If the previous chapter traced ideas, Chapter 7 follows the practices that transform them into a system of domination. Arendt identifies race and bureaucracy as two central devices of overseas imperialism. Race supplied a principle for separating rulers from subject peoples. Bureaucracy supplied a method of governing populations without creating a common political world. She begins with European encounters in Africa, where imperialists confronted societies they interpreted through fantasies of primitiveness and natural existence. Arendt's language reflects the categories of the period she is analyzing, but her political point is directed at the colonizers. Europeans who abandoned the restraints of their own institutions could experience the colonial environment as a world outside ordinary law. The temptation was to classify the people encountered not as fellow political beings, but as part of an alien landscape. This experience helped create what she calls the phantom world of the Dark Continent. The colonizers' imagination transformed human difference into evidence of racial separation. Because conquest placed Europeans in positions of overwhelming technical and military superiority, the relation itself could appear to confirm the ideology used to justify it. Domination generated the social reality that racism then presented as natural. South Africa becomes a crucial example. The discovery of diamonds and gold drew capital, fortune seekers, workers, and imperial interests into a society already structured by conflict among indigenous Africans, Boers, and British power. Economic exploitation and racial classification became intertwined. Race could organize labor, residence, political privilege, and access to resources. Arendt pays particular attention to the Boers because their historical experience produced a form of racial society before the high age of European imperialism. Isolated farming communities depended on slave and coerced labor and developed a strong sense of separation from both Africans and later British authorities. In Arendt's interpretation, their social order offered European imperialists a model in which race could replace ordinary political citizenship as the principle of organization. The mining economy intensified these patterns. Gold required large labor forces, concentrated capital, and powerful administrative structures. Imperial entrepreneurs such as Cecil Rhodes could combine business and politics in ways that blurred any line between private profit and public power. Economic expansion required control of territory and labor. Control was justified through racial hierarchy. Bureaucracy provided the corresponding political technique. Traditional government by law assumes that rulers and ruled inhabit a common legal order. Bureaucratic imperial administration could govern by decree. Decisions were issued from above, adapted to circumstances, and justified by necessity rather than by general law. The administrator did not need consent from subjects, or even a stable body of rights, through which they could challenge decisions. Arendt sees Lord Cromer in Egypt as an important imperial type, the administrator who believes himself detached from ordinary political passions and devoted to efficiency, necessity, and the management of populations. Such officials could sincerely regard themselves as serving order rather than personal interest. Yet precisely this self-image made bureaucratic power dangerous. Because administration appeared technical, it could escape political judgment. Government by bureaucracy also had an impersonal quality very different from constitutional impersonality. Under rule of law, impersonality means that general rules apply regardless of the ruler's private wishes. Under imperial bureaucracy, impersonality can mean that nobody appears personally responsible because decisions are attributed to administrative process. Power becomes anonymous and difficult to contest. Arendt links this style of rule to the imperialist character. Men attracted to imperial service often sought escape from the limitations and conventional morality of bourgeois life. Distance from Europe allowed them to imagine themselves as agents of historical forces rather than citizens bound by ordinary standards. Adventure, secrecy, administrative authority, and the experience of commanding people without political accountability created a new type of political personality. The imperialists could celebrate action without a stable purpose beyond expansion. Unlike a statesman who founds or preserves a political community, the imperial administrator manages an endless process. Territories, populations, and resources become stages in a movement that has no natural completion. This corresponds to the earlier principle of power accumulation for its own sake. Race and bureaucracy thus reinforce each other. Race declares that rulers and ruled do not belong to the same human and political community. Bureaucracy supplies a machinery for governing on that assumption. Once equality is denied in principle, law loses its universal claim. Once rule is conducted by decree, racial classification can be adjusted and enforced without the restraints of citizenship. Arendt's broader argument is that overseas imperialism created institutions and mentalities that Europe could initially keep at a geographical distance. At home, constitutional government and civil rights still operated. Abroad, arbitrary administration and racial domination could be normalized. The danger appeared when the distinction between colonial periphery and European center began to collapse. The next chapter examines continental imperialism, where there was no distant overseas space in which lawlessness could be isolated. Pan-German and Pan-Slav movements brought the logic of racial destiny, movement, and contempt for the state directly into the political structure of Europe itself. Arendt's discussion of bureaucracy is especially important because she does not identify arbitrary rule only with the personal whim of a tyrant. Imperial administration could be impersonal, methodical, and professionally disciplined while remaining lawless in a political sense. The official follows procedures and files reports, yet the subject lacks standing as an equal participant in a shared legal order. Administration replaces citizenship. The racial principle solved a problem created by this distance. If rulers had admitted that colonized peoples were political equals, indefinite foreign domination would have become difficult to justify. Race transformed inequality from a temporary result of conquest into a permanent fact of nature. Bureaucracy could then administer differences that ideology declared unchangeable. Arendt also sees the colonial adventurer as a symptom of European social disintegration. Imperial spaces attracted people for whom ordinary bourgeois careers and moral conventions had become constricting or meaningless. Outside Europe, personal reinvention could combine with enormous authority over others. The experience encouraged the belief that personality itself could be dissolved into service of an expanding process. The colonial world, therefore, did more than produce racist doctrines. It normalized political relations in which people were ruled without consent, law was replaced by decree, and administrative necessity excused actions that would have been scandalous at home. Continental movements later helped return these methods to Europe, where geographical distance could no longer contain them. Chapter 8. Continental Imperialism, the Pan Movements. Arendt turns from overseas empire to movements that sought expansion within Europe itself. Pan-Germanism and Pan-Slavism did not possess distant colonial territories in which arbitrary rule could be separated from constitutional life at home. Their ambitions crossed the borders of existing European states and appealed to peoples who were dispersed among several political jurisdictions. For this reason, continental imperialism attacked the nation-state more directly than overseas imperialism did. The Pan movements claimed that membership in a people was deeper than citizenship. A German could belong to the German racial or cultural community, even if he lived under the Habsburg Empire, Russia, or another state. A Slav could be part of a greater Slavic destiny, regardless of political boundaries. This replaced the territorial and legal principle of the nation-state with the idea of an organic people whose unity existed prior to law. Arendt calls this tribal nationalism. Ordinary nationalism can still identify a people with an existing state, and therefore with institutions, laws, and territory. Tribal nationalism imagines the nation as an enlarged family bound by blood. It is especially attractive where populations lack a sovereign state of their own, or where imperial borders mix national groups together. The nation is no longer primarily a political community, but a natural body scattered across political frontiers. The Pan movements therefore developed a special hostility to citizenship and legal equality. If blood determines authentic belonging, a state that treats different nationalities equally is already suspect. The Habsburg Empire, with its multiple peoples and bureaucracy, could be denounced by Pan-Germans because it refused to organize itself exclusively around German ethnic superiority. Russian Pan-Slavists could appeal to the Tsar as a possible leader of a transnational Slavic mission, while simultaneously claiming that Russian people possessed a destiny deeper than state institutions. Antisemitism entered this world with particular force. Jews were a dispersed people whose historical claim to chosenness and transnational existence appeared to Pan-movement ideologues as a rival model. Arendt argues that movements obsessed with their own divine or natural mission could reinterpret Jewish chosenness in vulgar racial terms. The universal religious meaning of a mission toward humanity was transformed into the fantasy of a people seeking domination over humanity. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theory then projected the Pan-movement's own ambitions onto Jews. This was more than prejudice. The idea of a hidden Jewish world organization helped the Pan-movements imagine politics as a struggle among supranational racial forces. Existing states and parliaments could be dismissed as superficial structures beneath which the real forces of blood and destiny operated. A movement claiming to represent those forces therefore felt entitled to stand above ordinary legality. Continental imperialism also inherited the political technique of bureaucracy. In the multinational empires of Central and Eastern Europe, government by decree had long been familiar. Decrees differ from laws in an important way. A law claims general validity and creates a framework within which people can know their rights and obligations. A decree exists primarily in its application. It comes from an administrative authority and can be altered as circumstances require. In emergencies, any government may use decrees temporarily, but where bureaucracy becomes the normal form of rule, decree acquires a different character. The administrator appears less as a responsible political actor than as an agent of an impersonal process. Information is withheld, reasons need not be publicly debated, and the population encounters power through orders whose source is obscure. Arendt sees this as an inheritance of lawlessness that later movements could radicalize. The Pan movements added ideology to bureaucracy. They claimed that history itself embodied a law of racial or national development. The movement did not merely advocate a policy, it represented an alleged historical force. Individual persons, legal institutions, and present circumstances could therefore be dismissed as temporary obstacles to a larger destiny. This helps explain the importance of the word movement. Traditional parties represent particular interests or principles within a state. They accept that other parties exist, and that politics involves competition among partial viewpoints. The Pan movements deliberately presented themselves as more than parties. They claimed to embody the people as a whole, and therefore to possess a legitimacy superior to parliamentary institutions. Arendt contrasts the continental party system with the Anglo-American tradition. On the continent, parties had often represented classes or interests, while the state claimed to stand above them. When confidence in the state declined, parties looked narrow and self-interested. A movement that claimed to transcend class and party could therefore appeal to people who no longer believed parliamentary institutions represented a common world. This anti-party appeal became especially powerful as European class structures weakened. Parliament could be portrayed as a marketplace of selfish interests. The movement promised unity, purpose, and direct identification with the people. Yet the supposed transcendence of interest concealed a more radical ambition. A movement did not want merely to govern within the existing state. It wanted to reorganize the political world around its own principle. The distinction separates pan-movements from ordinary nationalism, and even from some forms of fascism. A conventional nationalist may seek control of the state. A totalitarian movement, whose organizational model Arendt sees foreshadowed here, ultimately treats the state itself as an instrument. The movement claims a legitimacy that cannot be limited by constitutional boundaries because its supposed mission is historical, racial, or global. The First World War and its aftermath deepened the crisis. The old party systems lost prestige, class representation became less stable, and millions of people became politically available to movements that promised transformation rather than representation. The Weimar Republic provided a dramatic example. Parties defending the existing order competed with Nazis and communists who openly presented themselves as movements and appealed to those who wanted fundamental change. Arendt does not claim that the pan-movements themselves were already totalitarian. Their importance lies in the elements they developed: tribal nationalism, supranational racial thinking, contempt for law, government by decree, hostility to the party system, and the concept of a movement whose authority stands above the state. These elements would later be reorganized by Nazism and Bolshevism into institutions capable of total domination. The pan-movements were particularly successful at converting frustration with political institutions into a metaphysical claim about belonging. A citizen can criticize a state while remaining one of its members. A person defined primarily by tribal nationalism is encouraged to see the state as legitimate only when it expresses the destiny of his ethnic group. Political disagreement becomes betrayal of the people rather than conflict among citizens. This helps explain the movement's preference for vague, sweeping programs. A party must eventually formulate concrete policies and accept responsibility for results. A movement can retain energy through general claims about destiny, enemies, and historical mission. Its incompleteness becomes an advantage, because every compromise can be denounced as betrayal of movement. Arendt also stresses the political effects of bureaucratic empires in Eastern Europe. Populations accustomed to decrees from remote authorities could develop both contempt for legality and fascination with hidden power. When public institutions do not explain themselves, people become receptive to theories in which invisible forces secretly determine events. The conspiratorial style of the pan-movements therefore grew in soil already prepared by administrative opacity. Their historical importance lies in linking this mentality to mass organization. The movement offers a direct relation between leader and supposedly authentic people, bypassing the mediating institutions of parties, parliaments, and law. Totalitarian organization would later preserve the word movement while radicalizing its claim. Even the people become only temporary material for an endless process. Chapter 9. The Decline of the Nation-State and the End of the Rights of Man. The First World War marks, for Arendt, an explosion in the European political order. Empires collapsed, borders moved, revolutions created new regimes, and populations were displaced on a scale that existing legal institutions could not absorb. The most revealing victims of this breakdown were minorities, refugees, and stateless people. Their condition exposed a contradiction hidden inside the modern doctrine of universal human rights. The post-war peace settlements attempted to reorganize Central and Eastern Europe according to the principle of national self-determination. The populations were too mixed for borders to produce genuinely homogeneous nation-states. Newly created states contained large minorities whose language, religion, or ethnicity differed from the titular nation. Minority treaties were supposed to protect them, but the very need for special protection implied that ordinary citizenship could not be trusted to guarantee equality. Arendt sees a fatal contradiction in this arrangement. The nation-state had originally joined two ideas: sovereignty of the nation and equality of citizens before the law. Once the state began treating the majority nation as the true owner of government, minorities became people who lived within the territory but were not fully regarded as members of the political community. Equality before the law weakened as national identity became a criterion of political belonging. Minority groups quickly understood the weakness of international guarantees. They organized across borders and appealed to one another as national groups, rather than trusting the states in which they lived. In doing so, they unintentionally reinforced the principle that a person's real political identity came from nationality rather than citizenship. The minority system thus reproduced the problem it was designed to solve. Still more revealing were the stateless. The breakup of empires and the revolutionary era produced Russians, Armenians, Hungarians, Germans, and many others who either lost citizenship or were deliberately denationalized. Governments discovered that denationalization could be used as a weapon. By withdrawing citizenship, a state could remove a person from the legal community before physically expelling or persecuting him. The stateless person created an administrative crisis because the ordinary law of aliens assumed that every foreigner belonged somewhere else. A state could deport an unwanted foreigner to his country of origin. But a stateless person had no government obliged to receive him. International conferences could provide documents and temporary arrangements, but they could not create the missing political membership on which effective rights depended. This problem strengthened police power. If a person could neither be integrated as a citizen nor legally deported as an alien, police administration began handling him outside ordinary legal categories. Internment camps, residence restrictions, special documents, and administrative detention spread. Practices once regarded as exceptional became normal tools for dealing with populations who had fallen outside the nation-state system. Arendt notes a bitter paradox. For a stateless person, committing a crime could actually improve legal status. The criminal at least enters a defined judicial procedure. He has an accusation, a court, a sentence, and certain recognized rights as a defendant or prisoner. The innocent, stateless person may have no comparable standing because there is no legal category through which he can compel authorities to recognize him as a rights-bearing member of a polity. This leads to Arendt's famous analysis of the rights of man. The 18th century declarations announced rights belonging to human beings simply because they were human. These rights appeared to be independent of government, history, privilege, or nationality. Yet the experience of stateless people revealed that when individuals lost citizenship, supposedly inalienable rights often vanished with it. The calamity was not merely loss of particular liberties. Refugees might still possess life, bodily existence, personal opinions, and abstract human dignity. What they lost was a place in the world where their actions and words mattered. They lost membership in an organized political community capable of recognizing claims, enforcing laws, and treating their speech as part of a common public world. Arendt therefore speaks of a more fundamental right, the right to have rights. Before anyone can enjoy freedom of speech, property, political participation, or legal protection, he must belong to a community in which rights can be claimed and duties recognized. The great failure of the rights of man was the assumption that humanity itself could guarantee rights independently of political organization. The nation-state had concealed this problem during the 19th century because most Europeans possessed nationality. Human rights and citizen rights appeared almost identical in practice. Only when millions lost national protection did the distinction become visible. The world discovered that the abstract human being, stripped of citizenship and social position, was not protected more securely because he was now nothing but human. He was often protected less. Arendt rejects the idea that this proves natural human dignity is meaningless. The lesson is political. Equality is not simply given by nature. Human beings are born different in talents, circumstances, identities, and histories. Political equality is an achievement created by institutions in which people recognize one another as equals. When someone is expelled from that humanly constructed world, he is thrown back on mere natural difference. This is why the problem cannot be solved only by humanitarian sympathy. Charity may relieve suffering, but it cannot substitute for political membership. A refugee dependent entirely on goodwill remains without a claim that others are legally required to respect. Rights become secure only within a political order where the individual has standing. The crisis of statelessness also prepared the ground for totalitarianism. Totalitarian regimes learned to manufacture rightlessness before extermination. Denationalization and legal exclusion could remove groups from the protection of ordinary institutions. Once people had been made superfluous in the political sense, violence against them encountered fewer legal and social obstacles. Arendt sees the interwar refugee crisis as one of the clearest signs that the European nation-state had reached a structural limit. Its universal language of rights depended in practice on membership in particular nations. When nation and state separated, the contradiction became visible. A state claiming to belong primarily to one national group could not easily guarantee equal citizenship to people defined as alien to that group. The chapter therefore closes Part 2 at the threshold of totalitarianism. Imperialism had undermined legal boundaries abroad. Continental movements had attacked the state and party system from within. War had produced masses of people without citizenship, and the rights of man had proved politically powerless when detached from membership. The next part asks what happens when atomized. Uprooted populations become the material for movements that promise belonging through total ideological organization. Arendt's discussion of minorities also exposes the weakness of treaties that protected groups precisely as groups. The treaties often implied that members of minorities were not fully covered by the ordinary law of the state, but required international supervision. Majority populations could then regard minority protections as foreign interference, while minorities learned that their safety depended on powers outside the state, whose citizens they formerly were. The refugee problem revealed an even harsher truth about sovereignty. States defended the right to decide who belonged more effectively than international institutions defended the rights of those excluded. Once governments began revoking nationality, other states often responded by tightening borders, rather than by recognizing a universal status independent of citizenship. The supposedly universal person confronted a world divided into jurisdictions, none of which was required to accept him. This is why Arendt considers loss of political membership more fundamental than loss of freedom in the ordinary sense. A slave, prisoner, or persecuted citizen may still belong to a legal community that recognizes who he is, even if it violates his rights. The stateless person can lose the framework within which injustice itself can be articulated as a claim. He is deprived not simply of liberty, but of a recognized place from which to speak. The right to have rights, therefore, points toward a political rather than merely moral solution. Human beings need membership in a common world where equality is institutionally produced. Universal declarations remain fragile if no political body is responsible for making them effective. The disaster of the stateless showed that abstract humanity, by itself, had no police, courts, territory, or citizens obligated to answer a claim. Part 3. Totalitarianism. Chapter 10. A Classless Society. Arendt begins Part 3 by asking what kind of social material totalitarian movements organize. Their characteristic constituency is not a traditional political class but the masses. This distinction is fundamental. Classes are structured by recognizable interests, occupations, social positions, and institutions. Parties can represent them because members share at least some durable place in society. Masses arise when large numbers of people cease to belong securely to such structures. The mass man is not defined simply by poverty or lack of education. Arendt emphasizes isolation, political indifference, and the collapse of ordinary social bonds. People who had previously remained outside public life could suddenly become politically mobilized once the class system weakened. Their earlier apathy did not mean they were satisfied with the existing order. It often concealed the belief that public affairs were remote, corrupt, or meaningless. The First World War, inflation, unemployment, revolution, and social dislocation accelerated this breakdown in Europe. Millions experienced apparently private failure at the same time. Yet because class organizations and political parties had weakened, individuals often interpreted their situation not as part of a common interest that could be politically represented, but as personal ruin in a world that had lost meaning. Their similarities did not automatically create solidarity. They remained isolated even while sharing the same fate. This atomization is crucial to Arendt's understanding of totalitarianism. A movement can organize people who no longer trust ordinary institutions precisely because it offers them belonging without requiring the complicated negotiation of real interests. It promises membership in a historical mission. The individual who feels superfluous can become significant as part of a movement imagined to embody history, race, class, or some other force larger than ordinary life. Arendt compares Germany and the Soviet Union. In Germany, the breakdown of the class system and party representation produced large, politically homeless populations available to movements. In Russia, the situation was different because society had never developed the same stable class institutions. Lenin inherited a highly centralized state ruling over a socially disorganized population. Stalin then deliberately destroyed remaining independent social strata and organizations in order to create the atomized conditions totalitarian domination required. Collectivization and the liquidation of the kulaks were therefore politically important beyond their economic effects. The independent peasantry was broken as a social class. Artificial famine, deportation, and terror shattered village structures. Purges later struck workers, administrators, military officers, intellectuals, and the party itself. Organizations that might have connected individuals to one another independently of the regime were repeatedly destroyed. Arendt stresses the apparent irrationality of these policies. Destroying experienced managers, engineers, officers, and productive peasants damaged the Soviet economy and administration. If the regime were understood only as a conventional dictatorship seeking efficient government, much of this would make little sense. But totalitarian domination values organization of the population over ordinary administrative rationality. Independent competence, status, or solidarity can be dangerous because it gives people a place outside the movement. The totalitarian movement also differs from an ordinary revolutionary party. It does not regard seizure of the state as completion of the revolution. The state is only a temporary instrument. The movement must remain in motion because its ultimate ambition is permanent domination of individuals in every sphere and, in principle, expansion beyond existing borders. Stability itself becomes suspect. This helps explain the extraordinary loyalty that totalitarian movements can demand. Members are not simply attached to a program whose success can be judged through ordinary results. They are attached to a movement whose meaning lies in participation in an allegedly irresistible process. Defeat, contradiction, and policy reversal can be absorbed as tactical episodes because the deeper movement of history is assumed to remain true. Arendt then examines the temporary alliance between the mob and sections of the intellectual and cultural elite. After the First World War, some writers, artists, veterans, and intellectuals felt profound contempt for bourgeois respectability. They saw conventional morality as hypocritical, parliamentary politics as empty, and ordinary social success as spiritually dead. The violence and nihilism of the mob could therefore appear refreshingly honest. Members of the elite could enjoy watching respectable society humiliated by figures it considered vulgar or criminal. Totalitarian movements deliberately displayed contempt for conventional standards, turning scandal and brutality into signs of authenticity. What respectable society condemned became attractive to people who believed the entire respectable order deserved destruction. This alliance was based on mutual misunderstanding. The mob hoped to use the masses to replace established elites and gain access to power. Intellectual sympathizers imagined that the movement's destruction of hypocrisy might open space for some new authenticity. But once totalitarian movements seized power, both groups became expendable. Independent initiative, even when radical, threatened a system that demanded complete predictability. Arendt makes the surprising point that the ordinary Philistine could prove more useful to totalitarian crime than the romantic gangster. The Philistine is the person withdrawn into private concerns of family, career, and security, prepared to separate personal morality from public duty. Under the right conditions, such a person can participate in enormous crimes while continuing to think of himself as a responsible private individual. The totalitarian mass organization therefore does not depend on a population of fanatics or monsters. It depends on atomized people whose social worlds have collapsed, who seek belonging and certainty, and who can be organized around a movement that replaces ordinary reality with ideological purpose. The next chapter explains how propaganda and organization construct that alternative world before total domination is fully established. Arendt also emphasizes the difference between masses and the mob. The mob had existed as a byproduct of class society, composed of people from different strata who had been excluded from respectable success. The masses emerge on a far larger scale when the class structure itself breaks down. The mob can supply leaders and styles of behavior, but totalitarian movements need millions who are not organized by any stable interest. This helps explain why conventional parties repeatedly underestimated them. Parties counted voters through class, religion, region, profession, and other recognizable affiliations. politically indifferent people were treated as background. Totalitarian movements discovered that this apparently inert population could become decisive once mobilized around a claim that rejected the whole party system. Mass loyalty also differs from ordinary support. Because the movement offers an identity detached from specific interests, members can accept policies that visibly damage their own material position. What would destroy the credibility of a normal party can leave a totalitarian movement intact if sacrifice itself is interpreted as proof of devotion to the historical cause. Chapter 11. The Totalitarian Movement. Arendt distinguishes propaganda from terror. Before a totalitarian movement has complete power, it must operate in a world where other parties, newspapers, institutions, and sources of information still exist. It therefore uses propaganda to attract and organize the masses. Terror can accompany propaganda, but at this stage it remains limited by the surrounding legal order. Once total domination is established, the relationship changes. Terror becomes fundamental, while propaganda is increasingly directed toward the outside world or toward populations not yet fully incorporated. Totalitarian propaganda is unusual because it presents political claims as scientific prophecy. Nazi racism and Bolshevik interpretations of history claim to reveal hidden laws governing the future. The propagandist does not merely say that a policy is desirable. He says that history or nature has already decided what must happen. The movement presents itself as the interpreter and executor of an inevitable process. This gives prophecy a peculiar political function. Hitler could announce that another world war would bring the annihilation of European Jews. Stalin could describe political opponents as representatives of dying classes. Statements that would ordinarily be understood as threats or intentions are presented as predictions. When the regime later produces the predicted outcome through its own actions, it can claim that ideology has once again proved correct. The masses are especially receptive, Arendt argues, not because they are simply stupid or incapable of understanding facts, but because they have lost confidence in the reality supplied by ordinary social experience. In an unstable world, a complete fiction can be more attractive than fragmented facts. What matters is consistency. An ideological system can explain apparently unrelated events through one hidden cause, and thereby offer a sense of order that daily life no longer provides. This is why the enormous lie can be more effective than a small falsehood. A small lie still competes with an intact reality and can be disproved by ordinary evidence. A total conspiracy theory creates a whole explanatory world. Anti-Semitic propaganda could interpret finance, revolution, liberalism, capitalism, socialism, war, and national defeat as different expressions of Jewish conspiracy. Bolshevik propaganda could interpret setbacks, opposition, economic failure, and factional disputes through class enemies, wreckers, spies, or Trotskyist conspiracies. The conspiracy is useful precisely because it is elastic. Evidence against it can be reinterpreted as evidence of how deeply hidden the conspiracy is. The absence of visible Jewish world power can become proof of secret Jewish power. A loyal communist accused of treason can be said to have concealed his true nature for years. The ideology protects itself from falsification by converting contradiction into confirmation. Arendt also emphasizes the attraction of claiming secret knowledge. Totalitarian propaganda divides the world into what ordinary people think they see and what the movement alone understands. The initiate possesses a key to reality. This restores a sense of superiority to individuals who otherwise feel powerless and disoriented. The Nazi use of the protocols of the Elders of Zion illustrates the method. The value of the forgery did not depend on whether its factual claims could withstand investigation. It offered a model of global organization and conspiracy. Arendt argues that Nazi leaders could simultaneously denounce the supposed Jewish plan for world domination and admire it as a model to be defeated and imitated. The fiction of an already unified enemy justified the movement's own ambition to organize on a global scale. Totalitarian propaganda also steals and recombines themes from other political traditions. Nationalism can be joined to socialism, worker rhetoric to racial nationalism, revolutionary language to reactionary goals. The movement presents itself as a synthesis that has transcended old divisions. This is effective among people who no longer trust the party system, precisely because ordinary distinctions among parties appear obsolete. But propaganda alone does not explain the movement. Arendt considers totalitarian organization even more original than ideological content. The organization is built to turn a fictitious world into a social reality for its members. Long before the movement controls the entire state, it creates layers of membership that insulate adherents from the ordinary world. The outermost layer consists of sympathizers and fellow travelers. They maintain ordinary professions and social relations, and therefore provide a bridge between the movement and normal society. Their existence makes the movement appear less radical from the outside. An outsider can encounter respectable people who repeat parts of the ideology without seeming to live in a completely different reality. Inside this circle are ordinary members, then increasingly elite formations. Each inner layer regards the outer layers as less reliable and more naive, while the outer layers see the inner groups as more committed and authoritative. This onion-like structure has two advantages. It protects the core from the shock of outside facts, and it protects sympathizers from having to confront the full implications of the movement. A Nazi fellow traveler may accept nationalism and anti-Semitic slogans while not knowing the actual plans of the SS. An ordinary party member may know more, but still experience elite formations as guardians of a deeper truth. Similar structures appear in Stalinist parties, where official lines can change abruptly, while each level learns to interpret obedience to the leadership as evidence of superior understanding. At the center stands the leader. Arendt rejects the idea that the leader is simply an ordinary dictator at the top of a hierarchy. His position depends on identification with the movement itself. He claims personal responsibility for everything done by subordinates, while simultaneously making them instruments whose independent responsibility disappears. The famous principle that the leader is always right does not merely demand obedience. It makes the leader the source through which reality inside the movement is continuously interpreted. This structure allows sudden policy reversals without destroying loyalty. If the movement is defined by obedience to the leader, rather than by a stable platform, yesterday's truth can become today's error. Members who have invested their identity in the organization are encouraged to distrust their own judgment rather than the movement's consistency. The elite formations are especially important because they practice the movement's fictitious assumptions most completely. The SS did not merely believe in racial hierarchy as an opinion. It attempted to organize marriage, ancestry, career, reproduction, and eventually mass murder around racial categories. The secret police and party elite under Stalin similarly treated the fiction of conspiratorial enemies as the basis for arrests, purges, and administration. Organization thus creates the reality that propaganda first described. If careers, food, marriage, residence, and survival are actually distributed according to racial or political classifications, then ideology becomes part of everyday experience. Asking whether the categories are true begins to seem as pointless as questioning the existence of institutions that visibly enforce them. This explains a paradox Arendt notes after the fall of Nazism. When the regime collapsed, many former supporters appeared to abandon Nazi beliefs with astonishing speed. The ideology had been realized institutionally rather than preserved as an independent intellectual doctrine. Once the organized fictitious world disappeared, much of the belief structure disappeared with it. The apparent fanaticism had depended heavily on belonging to a functioning reality created by the movement. The totalitarian movement therefore prepares domination by destroying the distinction between fiction and reality for its members. Propaganda supplies a coherent explanation of the world. Layered organization insulates members from contradiction. The leader supplies the final interpretation. Elite formations translate doctrine into practice. When the movement acquires state power, these mechanisms do not settle into ordinary government. They expand, generating the strange institutional structure, secret police, and camps that Arendt analyzes next. The layered organization also gives the movement flexibility in dealing with reality. When an outside claim is useful, sympathizers can present a moderate version. When commitment deepens, members encounter a more radical interpretation. The center can therefore deny, soften, or intensify propositions without abandoning the core fiction. Different audiences inhabit different distances from the ideological center. Front organizations are particularly useful because they provide normal social forms through which the movement enters professional, cultural, labor, youth, or charitable life. People can cooperate with an organization without initially accepting total ideology. The movement thereby surrounds itself with a belt of normality and acquires access to people who would resist direct recruitment into an openly revolutionary body. Arendt's deeper point is that totalitarian organization solves the problem created by propaganda's conflict with experience. an isolated claim can be refuted. A socially organized fiction becomes harder to escape because one's friends, career, information, and status increasingly depend on accepting it. The organization does not merely persuade people that another reality exists. It constructs relationships that reward them for living as though it does. Chapter 12. Totalitarianism and Power. Once a totalitarian movement captures government, Arendt argues, it does not become an ordinary ruling party. The expectation that responsibility will moderate revolutionary extremism turns out to be mistaken. Totalitarian leaders do not simply want to administer a state efficiently, preserve a territory, enrich a ruling class, or eliminate organized opponents. They seek to preserve the movement's dynamism and extend its logic into every part of life. This creates a political structure that looks chaotic when judged by ordinary standards of government. In a conventional dictatorship, power may be concentrated brutally, but the hierarchy is usually intelligible. Ministries have functions, commands travel downward, officials know their jurisdictions, and the dictator wants the machinery to carry out decisions. In totalitarian systems, formal offices are repeatedly duplicated, bypassed, and deprived of stable authority. Nazi Germany offers Arendt's clearest example. Traditional ministries continue to exist, but party agencies, special commissions, SS organizations, and offices created for particular tasks overlapped with them. No written constitution announced that one structure had replaced another. Instead, new organs appeared beside old ones. Jurisdiction became deliberately uncertain. An official could possess a formal title while real power had shifted to a party body whose authority was less public and more directly connected to Hitler. The Soviet system produced comparable uncertainty through party institutions, police agencies, purges, and changing lines of authority. Offices that appeared powerful could suddenly be destroyed. Officials who had faithfully enforced yesterday's policy could become today's enemies. The instability prevented any subordinate institution from becoming an independent center of power. Arendt calls attention to the difference between authority and totalitarian leadership. In an ordinary hierarchy, authority becomes more defined as one approaches the top. In the totalitarian system, every layer can be bypassed by another layer claiming closer access to the leader. The decisive question is not the formal competence of an office, but its current relation to the center of the movement. This is one reason the system can seem administratively irrational. Agencies duplicate one another, instructions conflict, and economic needs can be sacrificed to ideological projects. Arendt argues that this is not merely incompetence. Stable institutions would create predictable interests and responsibilities. The movement instead needs uncertainty because it keeps officials dependent and prevents legal or bureaucratic routines from limiting the leader's freedom of action. The totalitarian state is therefore a state in appearance. The movement uses state institutions but refuses to identify itself permanently with them. A state has territory, citizens, laws, and interests that can in principle be stabilized. A movement defined by an alleged law of history or nature cannot accept a final condition. Its goal constantly recedes into the future. World domination follows from this logic. Nazi racial ideology and Stalinist claims about historical class struggle are not limited by national borders. If the movement represents a universal process, no external political community can be accepted permanently as neutral. Foreign states remain either future enemies, temporary allies, or territories not yet incorporated into the process. This helps explain behavior that appears self-destructive from the standpoint of national interest. Totalitarian policy can sacrifice economic efficiency, military rationality, diplomatic stability, or the welfare of the population, because the movement does not treat preservation of the existing nation-state as its highest end. Arendt repeatedly warns against assuming that rulers motivated by total domination will behave according to ordinary calculations of utility. The leader's role is to personify this movement. Totalitarian leadership does not simply issue arbitrary personal commands in the style of an Oriental despot. The leader presents decisions as deductions from forces larger than himself. Hitler executes the law of race. Stalin executes the law of history and class struggle. This gives personal power an impersonal ideological form. The ruler can claim limitless authority while presenting himself as the servant of necessity. This is also why totalitarian systems continually produce enemies even after real opposition has disappeared. A conventional tyrant needs enemies because they threaten his rule. Once enemies are defeated, repression can lessen. Totalitarianism needs enemies because its ideology describes history as a permanent struggle. If no actual enemy remains, the system must discover an objective enemy whose danger is defined independently of conduct. The category of objective enemy is central to Arendt's account of the secret police. Under older forms of political policing, secret police investigate suspects. They try to discover conspiracies, opposition, or prohibited acts. In totalitarian rule, the identity of the enemy can be decided in advance by ideological classification. Jews under Nazism are enemies regardless of individual behavior. Members of a supposedly dying class under Stalinism can be enemies even if they are completely loyal. This changes the meaning of guilt. The objective enemy has not necessarily committed a crime or formed an intention. His status follows from the movement's theory. If race science declares one group biologically dangerous, or the ideology of class struggle declares another historically doomed, the police need not investigate conduct in the ordinary sense. They administer a sentence already contained in the ideological premise. As categories are destroyed, new ones can replace them. Stalin's purges show the flexibility of the method. Former oppositionists, party officials, military officers, engineers, peasants, national groups, returning prisoners, or supposed conspirators could successively become targets. The ideological process must keep moving, and the police become the institution through which new objective enemies are selected and removed. For this reason, Arendt distinguishes the totalitarian secret police from the secret police of ordinary dictatorships. In the early phase of a movement, political police still confront actual opponents. Once total domination is established, however, real opposition becomes less important. The police know that the main categories of future victims are defined by policy. Their task is no longer simply to discover hidden crimes. It is to make ideological predictions real. The deepest secrecy of such a police system concerns not information about genuine conspiracies, but the future intentions of the ruler. A population may know perfectly well that arrests are occurring. What nobody can know securely is which category will be selected next. This uncertainty spreads fear beyond people who have done anything against the regime. Innocence loses protective meaning. Arendt also notes the strange position of the secret police within totalitarian society. In earlier tyrannies, the spy or informer may be socially despised, even if politically useful. Under totalitarianism, surveillance can penetrate normal relationships so deeply that the boundary between ordinary life and police activity begins to disappear. Friendship, family, workplace, and party membership can all become channels through which information flows toward the authorities. Yet even the police are not a final sovereign institution. Their leadership can itself be purged. Officials who carried out one phase of terror can be destroyed in the next. The system repeatedly removes people who know too much or who have developed independent networks. Nobody below the leader can safely convert service to the regime into a permanent legal position. This perpetual instability separates totalitarian domination from a police state whose ruling elite simply wants security. Totalitarian rulers are willing to consume their own instruments. What matters is continuation of the process, not protection of any fixed group of officials. The concentration camp is where this logic reaches its extreme. Arendt calls the camps laboratories for the totalitarian belief that everything is possible. They are not merely places of detention, punishment, forced labor, or mass killing, although they include all of those things. Their distinctive political function is experimental, to determine whether human beings can be reduced to completely controllable beings from whom spontaneity has been removed. This claim requires care because history contains many forms of cruelty. Slavery, penal labor, exile, prisons, massacres, and torture long predate totalitarianism. Arendt's argument is not that earlier oppression was mild. It is that the camp system introduced a different relationship between victim and political order. A slave remains part of a social system. He has an economic value as property and occupies a recognized status, however unjust. A convict sentenced to forced labor has been judged under some legal procedure and normally retains a relationship between a defined offense and a defined punishment. An exile is expelled from one place to another place in the human world. The concentration camp inmate can instead be removed from ordinary legal, social, and even utilitarian categories. The first step toward total domination is therefore the destruction of the juridical person. Before the camps can operate fully, people must be placed outside normal law. Denationalization, special decrees, racial classifications, arbitrary arrest, and protective custody create categories whose treatment no longer depends on individual acts. The camp itself is separated from the ordinary penal system. A person can be confined not because a court proved a crime, but because he belongs to a designated group. This is why the earlier history of statelessness matters. The collapse of citizenship showed that governments could create populations who lacked an enforceable right to rights. Totalitarian regimes radicalized the discovery. They first deprived targeted groups of legal standing, and then acted against people who had already been abandoned by normal political protection. The mixture of categories inside the camps further destroys legal meaning. Political prisoners, criminals, religious prisoners, racial victims, people labeled asocial, and other groups can be housed together and marked by different insignia. The categories do not correspond to a coherent scale of guilt. Their organizational purpose is partly to prevent solidarity and to teach inmates that treatment depends on arbitrary classification rather than intelligible justice. The second step is the destruction of the moral person. Ordinary moral action depends on the possibility of choosing between alternatives for which one can accept responsibility. The camps deliberately create situations in which meaningful moral choice is corrupted. Prisoners can be forced to choose between betraying friends and endangering family, between participating in the destruction of others and being destroyed themselves. Arendt's point is not that morality literally ceases to exist, or that prisoners become guilty for what is done under coercion. The political aim is to make moral judgment seem impossible. When every available choice has been engineered to implicate the victim in evil, the distinction between persecutor and persecuted can be psychologically blurred. Total domination seeks to deprive the victim even of the inner certainty that a morally meaningful action remains available. The destruction of memory belongs to the same process. Totalitarian regimes attempt not simply to kill people, but to make them disappear from the human world. Secret executions, anonymous burial, falsified records, and the isolation of camps attack the relationships through which a person's existence is remembered. The victim is treated as though he had never possessed a place among others. Arendt observes that the enormity of the crimes itself can make testimony difficult to believe. Ordinary common sense assumes that actions have recognizable motives. When victims describe institutions organized around apparently pointless suffering and destruction, outsiders instinctively search for a normal explanation. They ask what crime the prisoners must have committed, or what practical purpose the camps must have served. The unprecedented scale becomes a shield for the perpetrators, because reality sounds less plausible than a conventional lie. The third and most radical step is the destruction of individuality and spontaneity. After legal status and moral personality have been attacked, the camp subjects the body to conditions designed to make people interchangeable. Starvation, arbitrary punishment, forced labor, humiliation, overcrowding, and constant uncertainty destroy ordinary habits through which a person expresses individuality. The purpose is not simply to make prisoners obedient. Ordinary tyranny is satisfied when people do not rebel. Total domination seeks a being whose reactions can be predicted completely. Spontaneity is dangerous, because every new action contains something that cannot be deduced in advance. As long as a human being can begin something unexpected, domination is incomplete. This is why the camp is a laboratory, rather than only a terror institution. It tests whether plurality can be reduced to specimens of a type. Individuals are stripped of names, histories, rights, relationships, and choices, until the regime approaches what Arendt calls living corpses, beings physically alive but politically and morally removed from the shared human world. The system also trains perpetrators. The SS camp administration replaced some earlier spontaneous brutality with systematic procedures. Arendt emphasizes the frightening possibility that ordinary people can be trained to perform acts of extreme cruelty, not as uncontrolled sadists, but as disciplined functionaries. The goal is to make murder and degradation into routine operations within an organization. This routinization does not make the crimes utilitarian, One of Arendt's strongest claims is that totalitarian terror repeatedly sacrifices practical interests. Camps can consume laborers whose work the economy needs. Mass deportations can disrupt production. Skilled people can be killed. During war, resources can be diverted toward ideological destruction. Such behavior is incomprehensible if one assumes the regime's highest objective is prosperity, military victory, or even the private enrichment of rulers. The ideological objective is more radical: creation of a world in which the alleged laws of nature or history operate without interference from human spontaneity. If an ideology declares that certain races should disappear, extermination demonstrates the law's validity. If class theory declares certain groups historically obsolete, liquidation turns the prediction into fact. Arendt therefore returns to the idea of human superfluousness. Modern mass society and statelessness had already created populations who experienced themselves as unnecessary to existing institutions. Totalitarianism turns superfluousness into a governing principle. It acts as if categories of people can be removed without loss because human beings are replaceable material in a process. This applies finally even to the rulers and executioners. A system that treats everyone as functions of a movement makes its own officials replaceable. The secret policeman, camp commandant, party leader, and victim all inhabit different positions of power, but none possesses secure value as an individual. Total domination universalizes the premise that human beings are superfluous. At this point, Arendt introduces the problem of radical evil. Traditional moral thought usually explains evil through recognizable motives: greed, envy, hatred, lust for power, cowardice, revenge, or distorted self-interest. Even very great crimes can often be connected to such motives. The camp system confronts us with acts that seem to exceed these categories, because destruction can continue after practical reasons disappear. The phrase radical evil does not mean that the perpetrators are supernatural demons. Arendt's point is almost the opposite. A political system has appeared in which evil no longer needs an ordinary humanly comprehensible purpose. People can be processed, degraded, and destroyed because an ideological system requires their disappearance. The crime is connected to an attempt to make human beings as such superfluous. This is why ordinary utilitarian reasoning repeatedly fails before totalitarianism. Outside observers assume that a government will stop terror when opponents are defeated, preserve skilled workers during shortages, protect officials who serve it faithfully, or negotiate when compromise would improve national interests. Totalitarian rulers can do the opposite, because the preservation of a stable society is not their fundamental goal. The same misunderstanding affects diplomatic relations. Non-totalitarian states may assume that agreements based on mutual interest will constrain a totalitarian regime. But if treaties and temporary alliances are merely stages in a movement toward broader domination, ordinary calculations of reliability break down. The outside world keeps searching for stable interests where the regime understands only temporary necessities within an expanding process. Arendt does not claim that totalitarian rulers possess magical control or that their project can succeed permanently. Reality continues to resist fiction. Economies have material requirements, human beings retain capacities for spontaneity, and other states resist conquest. Totalitarian systems can destroy themselves through the same contempt for reality that gives them their terrible dynamism, but their historical significance lies in having demonstrated that institutions can be created with total domination as an aim. The camps show the extreme possibility. Law can be removed, morality can be attacked, individuality can be systematically broken, and mass murder can be organized without the conventional limits supplied by utility or stable political purpose. The chapter therefore brings together the themes of the entire book. Antisemitism supplied the idea of an objective enemy defined independently of conduct. Imperialism supplied experiences of racial rule, bureaucracy, and power detached from legal limits. Statelessness revealed how people could be expelled from the protection of political membership. Mass society created atomized individuals. Totalitarian organization combined these elements into a movement, and power transformed the movement's fiction into an institutional world. What makes totalitarianism new is not the quantity of violence alone. It is the attempt to reorganize reality so that human plurality, legal personality, moral choice, and spontaneous action no longer interrupt an ideological process. Chapter 13 now asks, what principle of government corresponds to this unprecedented ambition? Arendt's discussion of the so-called totalitarian state also explains why legal texts can become politically meaningless without being formally abolished. Constitutions, ministries, and statutes may remain on paper while the actual center of decision moves elsewhere. The existence of written law can therefore mislead outside observers who assume that formal competence corresponds to real authority. In the totalitarian system, the gap between public structure and effective power is itself a method of rule. The instability serves the leader because no subordinate can appeal to a fixed jurisdiction against another agency. When two offices compete, the winner is the one that better anticipates the current will of the center. This converts administration into a struggle for proximity rather than an application of settled rules. Officials learn that survival depends less on legal correctness than on detecting the direction in which the movement is presently moving. In the camps, the destruction of individuality is accompanied by deliberate attacks on solidarity. Categories, privileges, capos, differential treatment, and arbitrary punishments divide inmates. The regime seeks situations in which one prisoner's survival can be made dependent on another's suffering. The objective is not merely physical exhaustion, but destruction of the relationships through which people might still recognize one another as members of a common human world. Arendt is careful not to romanticize suffering as automatically producing moral greatness. Extreme domination can break people. The philosophical importance of the camps lies precisely in demonstrating that human personality depends on political, legal, and social conditions more than comfortable societies usually admit. When those conditions are systematically removed, traits often treated as naturally indestructible can be attacked. This is why the concept of superfluousness is so important. The camp prisoner is not merely exploited. Exploitation still recognizes usefulness. Total domination experiments with people whose existence is treated as unnecessary, even when their labor is temporarily used. A world capable of organizing human beings as superfluous has crossed a boundary that older theories of oppression do not adequately describe. Another feature of the camps is their deliberate separation from the ordinary world of usefulness and reciprocity. Normal institutions, even oppressive ones, tend to assign people some recognizable function. A worker produces, a soldier fights, a prisoner serves a sentence, a slave is treated as property. The camp attempts to create a space in which the inmate's treatment is not stabilized, even by such terrible functions. Work can be imposed and then rendered pointless. Punishment can occur without offense. Death can be postponed not out of mercy, but to extend domination. The destruction of predictability is itself a weapon. If good behavior could reliably reduce suffering, prisoners would retain a rational relation between action and consequence. If guilt explained punishment, legal categories would still matter. Total domination destroys these connections so that the inmate cannot organize conduct around a stable world of cause and effect. The regime alone defines what any action means. Arendt's account also explains why the camps have to be hidden from ordinary society, even when terror is publicly known. Their experimental logic conflicts with common sense so radically that ordinary political language cannot easily contain it. Secrecy isolates victims from witnesses, but it also protects the normal world from fully confronting what is being done in its name. The barrier around the camp is therefore political as well as physical. It separates a realm in which normal assumptions about law, interest, punishment, and human value have been suspended. This separation allows people outside to continue interpreting the regime through familiar categories, long after those categories have ceased to explain its core institutions. Diplomats can search for national interest, economists for rational labor policy, lawyers for crimes and penalties, and ordinary citizens for some reason why particular victims were chosen. The camp reveals that the regime is pursuing a different logic, one in which the production of completely dominated and ultimately superfluous human beings has become an end in itself. The regime's contempt for stable interest also appears in the relation between terror and loyalty. In an ordinary authoritarian system, loyal service may purchase safety. Totalitarianism undermines this bargain. Party veterans, police officials, military officers, and administrators can be purged after years of obedience because the movement cannot allow past service to become an independent claim on the future. A person who believes loyalty has earned rights has already begun to imagine a stable relationship that limits the leader's freedom. This is one reason confessions play such a peculiar role in Stalinist terror. The confession does not merely establish evidence for a court. It helps complete the fictitious world by making the victim publicly confirm the ideological interpretation of his own destruction. The regime can present an invented conspiracy as factual because the accused themselves have been forced to speak its language. In Nazi practice, retroactive legal measures served a comparable purpose by giving administrative crime a surface of formal consistency. For Arendt, however, even these devices remain secondary to the camp. The show trial still addresses an audience and therefore still imitates public judgment. The concentration camp aims at disappearance from the public world altogether. Its ideal victim does not persuade, confess, defend himself, or leave behind a politically meaningful death. He is processed anonymously as a member of a category. The result clarifies why totalitarian domination is directed against plurality rather than merely against opposition. Two people who disagree politically can still share a world in which disagreement has meaning. Total domination seeks to abolish the independent positions from which agreement or disagreement could arise. Everyone must become equally predictable before an ideological law that claims to speak prior to any human judgment. This makes spontaneity the final obstacle. A spontaneous act need not be heroic rebellion. It can be any initiative whose meaning the system did not assign in advance. An unexpected friendship, an independent judgment, a refusal to interpret a fact according to ideology, or a new beginning in thought or action. Because such acts reveal that human beings are more than functions of categories, the totalitarian project must treat even politically harmless independence as potentially dangerous. Chapter 13. Ideology and Terror, a Novel Form of Government. Arendt closes by asking whether totalitarianism should be understood merely as an extreme case of tyranny or as a genuinely new form of government. Political philosophy traditionally distinguished lawful government from lawless or arbitrary government. A constitutional regime acts through established law. Tyranny substitutes the ruler's will. Totalitarianism does not fit comfortably into either category. Totalitarian regimes openly violate positive laws, constitutions, and ordinary legal rights, yet they do not describe themselves as arbitrary. Hitler and Stalin claim obedience to laws more fundamental than human legislation, the law of nature in racial ideology, or the law of history in the theory of class struggle. Positive law is treated as superficial because the regime claims direct access to the forces that supposedly generate history itself. This produces Arendt's concept of terror as the essence of totalitarian government. Terror is not merely violence used to frighten opponents. Once totalitarian rule is fully developed, terror continues even after opposition has been destroyed. Its purpose is to accelerate the movement of the alleged law. If nature has condemned inferior races, terror removes them. If history has condemned dying classes, terror liquidates their members. The ruler claims not to choose victims according to personal preference, but to execute a sentence already pronounced by a process larger than human beings. In a lawful political order, laws create boundaries among people. These boundaries restrict action, but they also create a stable space in which individuals can move, speak, and begin new things. Tyranny destroys such boundaries and leaves isolated, frightened individuals facing the arbitrary will of a ruler. Total terror goes further. Arendt describes it as an iron band, pressing people together until plurality itself is threatened. Human plurality means that people are equal enough to understand one another but distinct enough that nobody can be reduced completely to another. Politics exists because a plurality of persons acts in a shared world. Totalitarian terror seeks to eliminate the unpredictable space between them. Individuals become specimens carried along by one historical or natural movement. For this reason, terror does not primarily need a principle of action such as honor, virtue, fear, or public interest. Classical political thought often described governments through the motive that set citizens in motion. Total domination tries to eliminate genuine action altogether. Its ideal subject does not decide. He participates in a process whose direction is supposedly known in advance. Ideology supplies the corresponding form of thought. Arendt defines ideology not simply as a false belief or a political doctrine. An ideology claims to explain everything through the logic of a single idea. Racism interprets history through race struggle. Stalinist ideology interprets it through class struggle. Once the premise is accepted, events are deduced as necessary consequences. The distinctive temptation is logical consistency. Real experience is messy. New facts appear, people behave unexpectedly, and events disrupt theories. Ideological thinking protects itself, by refusing to let experience interrupt deduction. If the theory says a class is dying, then members of that class must be treated as doomed, even if they appear loyal and productive. If a race is defined as dangerous, individual innocence cannot matter. Hitler's praise of ice-cold reasoning and Stalinist insistence on merciless dialectical logic express this mentality. The totalitarian ruler takes ideological propositions with a literal seriousness that earlier propagandists often did not. Metaphors become programs. Predictions become commands. Categories become death sentences. The force of ideology is strengthened by loneliness. Arendt distinguishes loneliness from solitude and from simple isolation. Isolation is political impotence. A person cannot act with others. Solitude can be fruitful, because someone alone can still remain in dialogue with himself and with the world of thought. Loneliness arises when the person loses reliable relations both with others and, in a deeper sense, with himself. Modern mass society had made loneliness increasingly common before totalitarian movements seized power. Traditional classes, communities, parties, and social bonds had weakened. Individuals could become uprooted and feel that neither their own experience nor the testimony of others provided a dependable world. Under such conditions, an ideology offering perfect consistency can become psychologically powerful. The lonely person has difficulty testing thought against shared reality. Logical deduction may seem like the last remaining certainty. If nobody can be trusted, and experience feels unstable, the proposition that everything follows inevitably from one premise can offer relief. The same logical coercion that organizes ideology begins to operate inside the individual mind. Totalitarianism exploits this condition and then reproduces it. It isolates people from one another through terror and surveillance, while ideology gives each isolated individual the same chain of reasoning. The regime creates a population simultaneously atomized and synchronized. People do not form a community through common action. They are held together through common submission to a process. Arendt insists that this is profoundly anti-political. Power in the political sense arises when people act together. Terror destroys this capacity by isolating individuals and making spontaneous cooperation dangerous. The resulting regime may possess enormous instruments of violence, but it destroys the human source from which genuine political power emerges. Totalitarian domination therefore contains seeds of its own destruction. A system hostile to spontaneity is hostile to the creativity and initiative needed for durable human institutions. It can devastate societies, but it cannot create a permanently stable human world. Its apparent omnipotence depends on a process that consumes the very plurality on which political life rests. Still, Arendt refuses the comforting belief that defeat of Hitler or death of Stalin removes the possibility forever. Totalitarianism revealed a new form of government, grounded in experiences and conditions that belong to the modern world. Loneliness, rootlessness, mass society, ideological thinking, and the temptation to organize humanity according to supposedly irresistible laws do not disappear automatically when particular regimes collapse. The book ends, however, not with fatalism, but with the idea of beginning. Every historical end contains the possibility of something new, because human beings possess the capacity to initiate actions that cannot be completely predicted from what came before. Arendt connects this capacity with freedom. She invokes Augustine's statement that man was created so that a beginning might be made. Each birth introduces someone new into the world. Politically, this means that no historical process can finally eliminate the possibility of a new beginning as long as human plurality survives. This final claim answers the logic of totalitarianism at its deepest level. Total domination tries to make human action predictable by reducing people to functions of nature or history. Freedom consists precisely in the capacity to begin what no process could fully deduce in advance. The existence of new human beings, therefore, carries a promise that ideology and terror can never make history completely closed. Arendt's investigation has traced how antisemitism, imperialism, the decay of the nation-state, statelessness, mass society, propaganda, bureaucracy, and terror could be combined into an unprecedented political form. None of those elements alone made totalitarianism inevitable. Their historical crystallization did. Understanding that crystallization is the purpose of the book. Comprehension does not reconcile us to what happened. It allows us to recognize the institutions and experiences that made it possible, and to resist the temptation to explain unprecedented evil through comforting cliches. The political task that remains is to build a common world in which human beings possess rights because they belong, power because they can act together, and freedom because each person retains the capacity to begin anew. Arendt's contrast between isolation and loneliness also clarifies why totalitarianism is not simply a problem of private psychology. Isolation can be imposed politically by destroying associations and preventing collective action. Loneliness becomes more radical when the individual no longer experiences a stable common world against which thought can be tested. The regime cultivates both. Terror isolates people externally, while ideology supplies an internally coercive logic that can continue even when nobody is physically present. The danger of ideological logic is not reasoning itself, but reasoning cut loose from experience. Genuine thought can interrupt itself when reality contradicts an assumption. Ideological deduction treats interruption as weakness. Once the premise has been declared infallible, the thinker is carried from conclusion to conclusion, as though freedom consisted only in recognizing necessity. Arendt's final appeal to beginning, therefore, restores exactly what ideology excludes: the possibility that something genuinely new can occur. Politics is not the execution of a known historical law. It exists because plural human beings can act together and initiate events whose full consequences cannot be calculated in advance. The concept of natality gives the conclusion its positive, political meaning. Human freedom is not primarily the private ability to choose among options already given. It is the capacity to begin, to introduce something into the shared world that was not logically contained in what came before. Because every person is born as someone new, history can never be reduced perfectly to process. Totalitarianism attacks this capacity by treating human beings as bearers of predetermined laws. Race determines destiny. Class determines destiny. The movement claims to know in advance where each person belongs. Arendt's final answer is that no such system can completely abolish the fact of plurality and beginning without abolishing humanity itself. The final warning is therefore double. The institutions of totalitarianism can collapse, but the experiences that fed them can survive. Uprootedness, loneliness, contempt for factual reality, and the longing for a single explanation that removes uncertainty. Political freedom depends on sustaining a world where people can appear to one another as distinct persons, test judgments against shared facts, and act together without being reduced to categories. The defense against totalitarianism is not a competing total ideology. It is the preservation of plurality, law, political membership, and the spaces in which new beginnings can occur. Arendt thus leaves the reader with a standard for political judgment that is deliberately modest and demanding at once. A political order must not promise to solve history by eliminating the unpredictability of human beings. It must instead build institutions durable enough to protect a common world and limited enough to leave room for action. The uncertainty created by freedom is not a defect to be engineered away. It is one of the conditions of politics itself.